now available in paperback and ebook. The Man Who Rules the World. John Haynes must bring together men and gods to overcome a threat that seeks to destroy the planet. The Man Who Rules the World. Now available in paperback and e-readers everywhere. I just saw Avengers Infinity War at the Magic Johnson today, and I was deeply disappointed by this film. When I take a look at this movie, I see the beginning of the end of Marvel Studios happening right in front of me. And the reason why I see the beginning of the end of Marvel Studios happening right in front of me is because after 10 years of setting up to this big event, the payoff just doesn't really compensate the viewer for their time. Now, many comic fans and MCU fans will say that Avengers Infinity War was the best film Marvel Studios ever produced. But what I saw at the Magic Johnson today was a jumbled, disjointed movie that was basically a half-done version of a part one of a Star Trek The Next Generation season finale. Because when I look at this film, it really reminds me of those part ones, of those cliffhangers for the Star Trek The Next Generation season finale. It sets up this big menace, and then it leaves the viewer with this big cliffhanger in the hopes of them being anticipating the next part coming up in after the summer for the fall season premiere. Now, the big problem with this whole setting up like a Star Trek The Next Generation season finale is that we have Avengers Infinity War, which is supposed to be this epic movie. And yes, it feels like a very epic movie and very grand in many of its visuals. And many of the visuals feel like comic panels come to life, like the scenes where the Hulk crashes into Dr. Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum, which literally feels like a scene that comes out of the Silver Surfer number 34 or the Infinity Gauntlet number 1, or the scene where Nebula is being torn apart, which is literally like one of the scenes in the original Infinity Gauntlet miniseries. Unfortunately, for all the big visuals and special effects and all the flash that's on screen, there's nothing as related to substance as related to the storytelling. And that's where the big problem is with Avengers Infinity War, is that for all the flash that's on screen, there's nothing as related to substance as related to the storytelling. And the screenplay really feels like a by-the-numbers, formulaic story that literally feels like a second draft that needed to be sent back for a second rewrite. And the reason why I say that this screenplay should have been sent back for a rewrite is because I saw many scenes in this film that were very uneven, and I saw many scenes of dialogue which really did not flow very smoothly, and I saw some dialogue lines that seemed fairly awkward, and some character motivations that were really underdeveloped. As related to the writing in this story, it's not really up to par, and it just does not really measure up to the visuals, and the writing really holds back the story. And one of the reasons I believe that the writing really did not actualize its potential is because the writing of the source material was not that strong. And when I look at Jim Starlin's Infinity Saga, it's a very shallow story, and the characters in that story aren't really that deep. A lot of people, they talk about how Thanos is this ultimate bad guy, but whenever I would read Infinity Gauntlet, I just saw that character as extremely overrated, and on screen he just comes across as so two-dimensional. Everyone sets him up as a bad guy, and they just set up people to be fodder, to be jobbed out to him, and that starts out in the opening scenes, which are meant to make him look like this uber bad guy where he's just killing all these Asgardians. But what the big flaw with that scene is, after they show this scene of him killing all these Asgardians, instead of us seeing Thanos as a super bad, we get this disjointed storytelling where they start telling us about Thanos instead of showing us why he's a credible threat. And when they introduce his henchmen to help him, that really sucks a lot of the energy out of what makes him a credible threat. Because what made him a credible threat in the original Thanos quest was he was doing this on his own without this black guard to back him up. He was literally going out on his own to do things, and that literally built him up as a little bit more of a credible threat and kind of added some veneer to his weak two dimensionality as a character. Unfortunately, in this story, when they introduce this black guard, what they do is they weaken Thanos as a character, and it takes a lot of the emotional resonance out of the story. If anything, all it does is it reminds me of Darkseid and his elect. And that really isn't something you want to do in a Marvel movie, is remind me of a DC character. Now, the other big problem as related to story is that there are so many characters on screen that you also don't see any emotional resonance as to the story. Now, they're trying to do with this Infinity story is show you that this Thanos is this big universal threat. Unfortunately, when you have so many characters on screen, that things happen to them and it has no real emotional impact on the viewer. And the reason why it doesn't have any emotional impact on the viewer is because when you just see a character come on screen for maybe 2, 3 minutes on screen, you haven't really connected with them unless you've been watching these films for 10 years. So if you're a new viewer and this is your first movie, you really don't really feel anything for any of these characters on screen. And the reason why you don't feel anything is because, again, the story is just very shallow. Now, there are efforts to try to rewrite Thanos from the comic book source material, and these deviations really do not help make Thanos look like this super bad everybody's trying to make him out to be. And when I take a look at the premise for why Thanos is going to go kill out half this universe, I still see the same old simp I read in the comics over 25 years ago. And instead of chasing under Death's purple robes, we have Thanos chasing a grand delusion like the Supreme Gentleman, Elliot Rodger. And your Thanos says he's going to has to kill off half the universe in order to stop people from suffering due to a lack of resources. And there's a huge flaw in that grand plan. The reason why there's a flaw in that grand plan for his quest to get the Infinity Stones to kill off half the universe is because it would never balance the universe. Now, some people would say Thanos is the mad titan, but I just see a stupid idiot. And the reason why I see a stupid idiot is because if he was to go out here and kill all the half the universe, what would happen is all the survivors would do is reproduce, and in a few eons, we would be back to square one as related to this whole resource issue and people suffering. So, killing people doesn't change anything when you apply a logic to this so called Titan's grand solution. Because when you take a look at his grand solution, it doesn't solve anything as related to anything. And anyone who would pick up a Bible and read Psalms 24, verse 1, would understand this. And anyone who would read the book of Ecclesiastics would read this. And then they would take a look at this story and look at the whole premise to try to change Thanos from a simp into this so called grand scientist and see how idiotic and imbecilic it actually is. Because when you have read the Bible and understand Psalms 24, verse 1, and have read Ecclesiastics, you understand how completely illogical this whole idea of killing half the universe to to preserve resources would just fall apart. And that's where the film starts to fall apart, because when you look at Thanos' motivations and the attempts to change his motivations, they really just wind up making for a very weak story. And that story really starts to fall apart. And when Star-Lord has the confrontation with him on the planet for the Reality Stone, and that's when the whole story really starts to fall apart. Because when we see Star-Lord confront Thanos in that scene, there's a whole story just starts to crumble. But the story meanders on in Thanos' quest to get the Infinity Stones, and heroes get jobbed out and beat up, and people get killed, and everything goes to a really disjointed climax. And after numerous sequences of overdone special effects sequences and more jobbed out heroes, Thanos finally gets the Infinity Stone in Vision's head And then we get this ending that really reminds me of something that comes straight out of a Star Trek The Next Generation season finale. And as I looked at this film, and after I watched it, I didn't see this big, epic movie with these grand visuals. What I saw was a by the numbers story and a lot of big special effects, but again, no real story with any sort of substance to it, no sort of depth to it, and nothing that really resonated with the viewer. Yes, we got to see our favorite Marvel characters again, but we really didn't get to see them in a story that was worthy of them. When I look at this story, I just see a really hollow story, a really shallow story, and a story that really, as I saw it, really tried to call itself modifying the source material and trying to change the source material, but not really doing anything that really grabbed you and made you look at it and say that this was something special. Outside of being an adaptation of one of Marvel's most popular comic book stories, I didn't really see anything special about Avengers Infinity War. It just felt like a very formulaic and by the numbers movie, and a movie that, again, feels like it was ripped straight from a Star Trek The Next Generation season finale. And I believe that they stole a couple of scenes from some of my stories when I was looking at this movie, because I saw a couple of scenes that looked like they came straight out of my John Haynes sequel, The Man Who Rules the World. And when I was looking at a scene of Star-Lord shooting at Thanos and then him turning his laser shots into bubbles, I had to wonder if these screenwriters actually picked up a copy of The Man Who Rules the World and looked at the climax where John Haynes and Eve Stein were taking on God Cassius after he destroys 4 Times Square. And I also had to think about another scene towards the end when half the universe's beings were being turned to dust. Because I look at that scene and I also see another scene that came from The Man Who Rules the World in the climax where John Haynes is taking on God Cassius. And after he had defeated God Cassius, that was something I had imagined happening to God Cassius as the final fate. Unfortunately, when it comes down to the screenwriters of Avengers Infinity War, it just doesn't seem like they executed well on concept, even after deriving from my, as I see it, my John Haynes, The Man Who Rules the World, and several sequences like the rolling tanks, which I believe actually came from Paul Dini and Bruce Timm's Savage Time, and the whole thing with Thanos and his premise that comes really from Lexiac. I believe that they just couldn't execute on those concepts, even though derived from those concepts, because again, none of the scenes in the story have any of the emotional resonance or the depth, because the story is so shallow. And the reason why it doesn't have any emotional resonance is because, again, there are just too many characters in this story to care about anyone or connect with anyone. And when I look at this Infinity War, I just don't see anything that makes you, you know, really feel anything or really make you think about anything. It just is, again, a very shallow movie that is meant to entertain, but is very, very on the surface. There's no real depth from it, like movies like Terminator 2, Judgment Day, the Star Wars trilogy, or some of the other classic science fiction and fantasy films. And that's what's really sad about Infinity War, is that there was an opportunity here to really make a cinematic classic with this story, but the Marvel Studios, as I see it, they really fumbled the ball on this one. And when I take a look at what was presented on screen for Avengers Infinity War, and I take a look at what was presented there, I really see a studio that has grown really arrogant and complacent in the last decade, because a lot of the things they had in this film, a lot of the bantering, a lot of the jokes, a lot of that stuff really did not belong in this film. The screenwriter should have cut that out, because this film should have taken a more serious tone, because if this is supposed to be a grand and epic threat, then we need to see these characters getting serious about it and not bantering back and forth making stupid jokes, and we really needed to see some cohesion as related to many of the sequences and seeing them transition more organically, because when I take a look at some of the sequences, they were extremely uneven. A lot of the sequences, they just didn't come together, because in some scenes we have things being shown, and then we have a lot of scenes where things are told, and nothing really comes together in a solid and cohesive way like the original Star Wars trilogy did, or Terminator 2 Judgment Day did, as related to storytelling. And when I take a look at Marvel Studios again, I just see on that screen a studio that has grown very arrogant, has become very complacent, and has taken the craft of filmmaking for granted, taken its audience for granted, and is starting to lose its own way. When I look at Marvel Studios' Avengers Infinity War, it shows me a studio that is starting to head down the dark road that Joel Schumacher and the Salkinds went, because Joel Schumacher and the Salkinds thought they could start deviating from the source material, and they thought their ideas were better than the original source material. And they started making changes in the hopes of making things better. Unfortunately, eventually, what happened was eventually their changes led to the complete collapse of the Superman franchise back in the late 1980s, and the collapse of the Batman franchise in the 1990s. And when I take a look at Avengers Infinity War, I see another stumbling block headed towards decline. And that's why I say that Marvel Studios is in trouble, because I see a studio that is extremely complacent, a studio that is extremely comfortable, and people who are too comfortable with characters start thinking that they can change characters to reflect their narrative and not be themselves, and be what they want them to push, but not what the viewers know. And that's what I saw on the screen in Avengers Infinity War. Everybody's friends, everybody's comfortable, but no one really takes the story seriously. No one's taking the craft seriously, because, again, I look at that screenplay, and as a screenwriter myself, a novelist myself, I saw a story that needed to be sent back for a rewrite. That screenplay just was not strong enough to be up to the par of many of the Russo's visuals or the special effects. And a lot of the special effects, I believe, could have been cut back some, because a lot of it, like Avengers Age of Ultron, was a lot of clunkiness, it was a lot in the way, and it was very distracting. I believe in a less is more approach, and I believe a less is more approach would have really helped make this a leaner, tighter, more cohesive film that would have not only entertained but resonated with the viewer, because there was just too much clunk and the story was just too uneven. And I believe after a third or fourth rewrite, they could have had a classic on their hands. But as the film stands right now, it's a very shallow story, it's a very hollow story, and basically it sets up like a Star Trek The Next Generation season finale featuring time travel. So all those people out there who are getting upset about their favorite characters dying, I really wouldn't get too upset about anything, because I see where a lot of this is going to get undone in either Captain Marvel or Avengers 4, because as these time travel stories usually work, there's usually some way to easily undo them. And when I look at this story, it looks like another by the numbers time travel story, similar to Star Trek The Next Generation season finales. So if you want to go see Avengers Infinity War, go right ahead. It's a fun little popcorn movie for those who like Marvel superheroes and Marvel Studios, but don't expect much in terms of story, substance, or anything that will resonate with you like the original Star Wars trilogy, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, or some of those Star Trek The Next Generation season finales. If you want something on that type of substance, you should go watch either Terminator 2 Judgment Day, the Star Wars trilogy, or Star Trek The Next Generation, or check out my novel, The Man Who Rules the World. But when it comes down to this film, there's not much here in terms of substance. It's got a lot of flash, but the story just is far below par. If you want to try some of my SJS Direct fantasy titles like The Man Who Rules the World and The Temptation of John Haynes, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. And if you want to help me make more videos like this,
you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.